We need to talk about something interesting.
Do you know what the definition of futility is? You probably have a good idea. It's kind of the point of Madoka Magica, right? Well, consistently slamming my head into creating anime content that will nevertheless be copyright stricken seems to fit that definition pretty well. If you'd like more details, I have a video explaining what happened and why episode 6 may not be viewable, and also why this is now a slideshow and will be a slideshow going forward. It is so beyond anything I can even remotely express to you in sort of passionate words that I think it best not to even try. So I would highly encourage everybody just to follow the playlist and subscribe to the channel so you'll actually see the uploads. But just more so than increasing my stress levels and affecting my health negatively, the very, very regrettable thing that this copyright strike does is remove the comments or my ability to see the comments on the previous video.
Hold it!
If I had any head hair left in my life, I would rip it out at this. Maybe I'll start pulling out the beard instead. I had started taking notes, so I have a couple here to address to you, but I sincerely apologize for everybody whose comment got lost. There were some really good ones and stuff I wanted to talk about this time too. Mumi usually pings me on Discord and questions how much Kyubey really is in on everything or how deep Kyubey goes. Could it, they suggest, have manipulated Hitomi into the witch's kiss in episode 4? That's a very interesting idea, and one that, yeah, if we're giving Kyubey a little more credit than the base of the text would allow, if we're giving that in the subtext, then yeah, I totally think that Hitomi's manipulation by Ellie in episode 4 could be within the bounds of Kyubey. We saw in Rebellion that it's a mistake to misunderestimate them, right? As a side note, misunderestimate and irregardless are two of my favorite words. Could we also consider the fact that Hitomi goes for Kyosuke to be some sort of manipulation by Kyubey? There's no textual evidence for that whatsoever, but who knows? A late comment on our first episode that I do happen to have access to is Josue Roberto bringing up a fanfic of Junko talking to Kyubey the night before Walpurgis Nacht arrives, which has a bit of backstory about Junko being potential candidate who never contracted with Kyubey. It's a really great, really quick read, and you can find a link in the description below. I have so much still left to say about Junko Kaname and her role in this story, but we'll get there when we get there. I just really love why she's included in this story, how she's able to indirectly affect and beget everything that happens in this show, and how like the final gate before Madoka can go make her wish is her mom grabbing onto her hand. But again, we'll get there when we get there. Something that a number of people actually contested me on, and I'm very happy for it, and I kind of knew they would when I brought it up, was that fact of Kyubey lying to the girls about how the world works or how the grief seeds function. I understand it's a bit of a stretch because there is no textual evidence for it, or, limited textual evidence. And specifically, Homu wrote a comment that, again, I can't post here because thanks Google. But if you'll remember, Homu is one of the fans of the extended universe and To the Stars fanfic and all of the kind of hard sci-fi that goes into the series. So in this kind of nebulous emotional attachment to the MacGuffin, and my suggestion the other way is that the emotional state of the girls is the only thing that matters, and the grief seed and soul gem really only being a representation of the emotional state. I knew going in that a number of people who are really invested in the mechanics of the world weren't going to take kindly to that idea. I don't know that it's a hill to die on, and I don't know that it means too much either way, so I won't contest it. But I will say that if we're doing this story about lying and everything, the only evidence that we see is Sayaka falling into despair through her life and then turning into a witch. This conveniently goes along with her refusal to use a grief seed to purify her soul gem. I think my general idea for raising this point was to address something larger in the Magical Girl canon, that the real enemy is suicide. The real enemy is giving up. I'm talking largely outside of Madoka Magica here. In fact, I would say this is one of the most consistent and regular themes in any magical girl show, even ones that are aberrant or far from the nexus of what we know as the core magical girl experience. I'm not going to hit you with the litany again, but I would challenge you to find one magical girl show that is not inherently about somehow finding the optimism to continue to fight and to continue to struggle and to continue to have hope. And I think the overwhelming majority of antagonists that you see in these types of shows are specifically designed to kind of embody that negative emotion or that stagnant nature or that giving up, the recession into despair in whatever form that takes for that show. And the protagonist's ability to overwhelm that emotion is the whole point of the genre, or one of them at least. So I don't know whether the grief seeds are intrinsically tied to the girl's life or life force or anything along those lines in Madoka Magica, nor do I really care. I really care that it is an accurate representation for that emotional state, for that giving up, and for that suicidal attitude. And once again, I'm sure the points Homu brought up in their comment were great, and I am very sorry I can't address them poignantly and directly. I'd also like to throw out real quickly here a beautiful video that I saw from Hello Future Me, where he talks specifically about hard magic systems versus soft magic systems, and the advantages of each and when you would use them, and it's kind of exactly in line with what I'm saying here. I think this is a series where we need a soft magic system much more than we need a hard one. This kind of slides nicely into another comment whose commenter's name I did not write down, that suggested witches as monster of the day and wants to talk a little bit more about that. The monster of the day formula is something that I think a lot of magical girl series never really worked out or never really codified. I think maybe you look at something like Heart Catch Pretty Cure or Princess Tutu as some that kind of really got it and used the episodic characters of the episode to kind of create this mini emotional conflict where the character does fall into this pit of despair, and then it's up to the adamant nature of the heroine's hope and effusive nature of their positivity to bring them out of it, not just by punching them or hitting them with the pink sugar heart attack or whatever have you, but doing this Princess Tutu-esque thing of let's talk it out, let's come dance with me, you know? Princess Tutu, coincidentally, one that actually inverts the monster of the day with the animals, saying something poignant about kind of who we consider human and looking at other people by reducing them, and yeah, that's a video for a whole other time and one that's always been in the back of my mind. Anyway, that brings us again to Madoka Magica. Consider a witch not as a witch, but a magical girl who has accepted suicide and fallen into despair, who has given up. That's not too hard of a concept, right? Like, that's still kind of easy to grasp and kind of necessary to grasp for the events of episode 9 to even function. So in this way, the girls are fighting these other magical girls, but they're not attacking the concrete issue. They're not trying to resolve it in this Princess Tutu or Heart Catch Pretty Cure kind of way. They're just killing other magical girls. Now, it's completely understandable because the witches lack the ability to communicate with the magical girls and express their sapience, if it is there at all. And of course, they are aggressive to the magical girls and others besides. Are we so blinded by the form change that we're unable to recognize what's really going on here? The elements of each witch's labyrinth still display the thing that they're tormented by, that they fell into despair for. Because we can't understand their cries, we deem them subhuman? Because they're hurting other people with their attitudes and their negative emotions, we say they must die? Even if they didn't change form, Sayaka is shown in episode 8 to hurt other people with her actions, in exactly the same way her witch form would. And indeed, in Rebellion 2, when we see Homa Lily, we see the exact same thing. There's still a consciousness trapped in the witch, there's still issues that they need to resolve. And here we are, taken for granted, because Kyubey told us so, that the witches are just something to be destroyed, that you're duty-bound to hunt. No, I say, much like Nephrite, much like the Spectre Sisters, much like Fisheye, the witches are other potentials, other characters that need help, that are screaming out for it. for just someone to understand their pain and inspire hope in them after the circumstances that they fell into led them to believe there was none. Just like every monster of the day in Hard Catch Pretty Cure, just like every monster of the day in Princess Tutu. But kind of stay with me on this conceptual level that we broached with the idea of the hard and soft magic systems. If the witch is this magical girl who is negatively affecting people, who has these suicidal thoughts or these tendencies to abandon hope, then aren't they, if they were just still in their magical girl form, wouldn't they be able to spread those ideas to other people? Wouldn't that negative mentality kind of still come from them and propagate? If Sayaka gives up hope and doesn't become Octavia, then doesn't she still kind of either kill herself or, live in this way that she is doing nothing positive onto the world? Heck, this reading of Witch as still largely magical girl, just in a different form, is very much invited by a lot of the content of Madoka Magica. In the story itself, like episode 9, yes, but also in things like Rebellion and in Magia Record. There's a lot of textual stuff in there that would give credence to this kind of, persona-esque, just another side of me, I am thou, thou art me vibe. I just happen to like it because it fits completely with the idea of the battle back and forth between hope, between giving up, So in this way, Witch as monster of the day really works. If these are Heartcatch monsters of the day, then we need to redeem them. If these are Princess Tutu monsters of the day, then yes, we need to talk it out with them. And by failing to do so, everybody is failing to be the magical girl, or buying into this system that they've set up where they look at these eldritch abominations as monsters, right? That they judge them as evil because of their appearance, because of their actions. But that goes against the concrete foundations of what a magical girl should and could do. And it's why episode 9 is my favorite episode and hits the hardest, because they attempt to do this redemption. They attempt to do something that you would see on a mid-level baddie, or, an episodic villain. I think they fail, however, because they don't do it well. And that's something we'll have to say for episode 9 if we ever get there without them taking down all these videos. But that core concept, that core idea that these witches are still in some way retaining some element of humanity and then the show is just prescribing us to write them off, that is magnificent. Angel Dude 101 wrote a long comment that I have no idea what it included because I only wrote a respond to this comment. So thank you, Angel Dude, for your due diligence, and boy, I wish I knew what it was. I think it was largely responding to some of the other elements that I brought up that were kind of wishy-washy in this same vein. I do remember what it wasn't, and it wasn't a comment based on the, scene with Madoka or Madoka's arc in this show, or anything about Junko and Madoka drinking. One of the things I really believe about content creation or presenting an argument is that if somebody can't find a flaw with your argument, they simply won't comment on it. Like, take some time and think about what you think the most important part of episode 6 is. You'd probably say the revelation at the end of the soul gems being their souls, or generally how the relationship dynamics shift between Kyoko and Homura and everybody. However, I would adamantly say it's the scene of Madoka drinking with her mother, and that's by far the most important thing in the entire episode. So I feel pretty confident that my reading on that was strong enough that nobody would challenge it. Oh wait, maybe was Angel Dude's comment about the Crippled girls? Or no, more specifically the idea that Japanese disability is handled very poorly, or seen in a much more different cultural lens than it is in the West. And this in some way could affect our reading of soul gems. Whereas in the West, we kind of have this very, spiritual representation of the soul as existing somewhere outside of our body, or that it transcends our, elements of our body. The soul in Japanese has a different kind of reading, being more attached to the body and more kind of spread out. It's well known that Japanese look at, physical disabilities very negatively. And I think there's a lot of media and counterculture stuff that you can see that kind of plays with that. Take something like Shindo L's manga and Katawa Shoujo. But yeah, this idea that you're somehow not whole anymore once you lose a part of yourself, it could really amplify that reveal of the souls being disconnected from the body and make it much more egregious of a thing. Very much akin to losing your soul, which would then tie it back into Mephistopheles and Faust. And, we'll see actually a little bit of this, how Cube kind of controls the soul now that it's outside of the body in this very episode, in the first scene. So yeah, great pull there if that was your comment, Angel Dude. I don't know. Someone, whoever it was, thank you so much, wrote a very long and very in-depth comment on their perception of the series. And it kind of embodies, I don't want to reduce it to this, but it was emblematic of a lot of the arguments that I've seen over the years of Madoka Magica kind of supporting rebellion. I'm well established already of being very much bearish on rebellion, and it would come as no surprise that somebody would, speak up when I'm kind of taking these cheap shots at the movie. And actually, like Storytime, I don't think Rebellion's that bad of a movie, and I kind of like a lot of it, but we'll get there when we get there. For the purposes of defending this maybe meme, but kind of mostly a wholehearted conviction against Rebellion's ending, I want to bring up the counterpoint here. The reading that I see as most supporting Madoka Magica Rebellion, and the one that this commenter brought up, centers around the idea that Madokami's wish or Madokami's actions are in some way incomplete or selfish or not an eternal resolution to everything that's going on. A quote, I think, from their comment: Homura and Madoka are just taking turns trying to do everything by themselves in a pretty authoritarian manner. In a standard Mahou Shoujo anime, having good intentions and slamming your forehead into the wall in pursuit of filling those intentions is enough to succeed. In Madoka Magica, it isn't. That is how they are different. I understand the assertion here, and I can understand how you would get to that viewpoint, honestly. That said, I really do stand in stark opposition to this viewpoint and do not in any way believe it. Because what you're functionally saying here, when you're saying that, having good intentions and then following through on them again and again isn't enough to succeed in Madoka Magica, is that you're saying this is a show where miracles and magic don't exist. Because that's what a miracle is, especially in the context of a magical girl show. It's believing in these lofty ideals of love and justice, and that courage and compassion have power and will influence your world positively, and then acting as if they do. And by the simple fact of acting like they do, you then paradoxically create a world in which they do. So yes, having good intentions and then ridiculously and idiotically following through on those good intentions and believing them with all your heart is enough to triumph, is enough to succeed. And that is the center of everything. That's the center of literally every magical girl. That is the reason I enjoy this genre. If we throw that out, or if we say Madoka Magica abandons that by reading Madoka's Wish as, suboptimal or not a manifestation of that, then we discount the power to give those things legitimacy. And I agree, yes, that is what the ending of Rebellion kind of sets up. And I agree again that that is what I dislike about Rebellion. The fact that you believe that and you accept that reading of Madoka Magica and of Madoka's Wish and the associated things that go along with it, that Homura never truly believed in Madoka's Wish in episode 12, etc., kind of says to me that I think they failed you. And by they, I mean the Magia Quartet, the Shaft, everybody, the Urobuchi and Shinbo. I think that they created what amounts to a Revolutionary Girl Utena ending where it's ambiguous enough to misinterpret the point, or that the ending of Rebellion retroactively paints the series ending in a light where you are allowed to read this reading, or that it's invited in that way, and that ruins that reading of miracles and magic do exist. That what Madoka says, that if people tell me it's wrong to have hope, I'm going to tell them they're wrong every time. Those, really core magical girl values. You're saying Madoka Magica isn't a magical girl show anymore. And by doing that, you then destroy everything that this show is doing to establish the magical girl reading, or the arc that the show's going through. And I'm not saying that you can't have a show that would do that, right? That you can't have a show that ends negatively. You can't have a school days type situation, right? A nice boat. But I think Madoka Magica originally was intended to be a redemption on the magical girl story, or a restructuring of the magical girl story and a reinforcement of the magical girl story. And the series is best read as that. That I don't think this retroactive and forced nice boat ending to Madoka Magica, or nice boat reading, really is worth honoring as a canon one. And yeah, this is much more for the Rebellion video, but I did want to bring up the fact that I came across the Madoka Magicast lately. It's something that you should definitely check out if you like listening to people talk about Madoka Magica, which ostensibly you do. They have a great take on Rebellion, and they've kind of already made my video for me in a lot of ways. The points that I would bring up about fan service, about the incoherency on a lot of things, and specifically about the ending, they have a distaste for it, or at least one of the members of the podcast does, because of the same things that I mention here. How it retroactively ruins or discolors the purposeful re-establishment of the genre that happens in Madoka Magica. Anyway, I'm sure that won't be the final word on it, and if you have a ton of good points, hopefully I can, copy them down in a notepad this time and respond to them all in kind. So yeah, if you think you have a much nicer opinion of the ending of Madoka Magica Rebellion, definitely leave it in the comments, and we'll make it an ongoing discussion instead of just one video that could be stricken and taken down. By the way, I'll put a link to the Magicast and the previous video I mentioned in this section down in the comments, so go check them out. Okay, so getting into the episode, the establishing shot setting the time, and then the establishing shot setting the place. There's a bit about the phases of the moon and everything here, but I don't think it's particularly relevant for understanding this scene. Also, this place is a newer one. It's something we've rarely seen. Sayaka's home base or apartment complex where she lives alone. We've already gone over that. We're shown again her walking, and this time straight down, right, in the shadow reflection. We're shown her walking very slowly. Direct contrast to the opening scenes of the previous episodes. And I think the real favorite shot of mine is this one right here, with Sayaka standing in front of the light, Kyubey sitting on one of the chairs in the darkness all around them. Ongoing light motif throughout the show, right? Fairly understandable, fairly basic. Ongoing empty chair motif. There are 4, 5, 6 chairs in the shot. That's too many chairs. Once again implying that other magical girls along the line have found out this secret. That's possibly saying something that it doesn't really matter to Kyubey if they find out the truth, because this will still ultimately end in their despair. And if this even accelerates Sayaka's despair, then all the better. Kyubey's equivocating here is absolutely Gen Urobuchi bullshit. It's so classically mean, so deceptive, and a way of writing a character that doesn't feel that they are deceptive, but are acting in a deceptive manner, clearly to the other characters. It's not hard to understand who we should be relating to in this scene. The next shot, very intense though, as the camera is put right in Kyubey's point of view. A wonderful shot that entraps the viewer, that can't escape Sayaka's wrath. It's also very close to Sayaka. Understandably, this is a huge point for her. And now, very quickly, on the line of, well, you never asked, that has been reversed here. We now have a shot of Sayaka in the mirror in a very awkward way. This shot to have happened would have to be Sayaka gripping onto the mirror instead of focusing on Kyubey. Just with this one little directing choice, they've inverted it, they've marginalized it, they've, through the directing, turned it back on Sayaka. Instead of her cornering Kyubey and asking it to answer for what it's done, Kyubey's words have put Sayaka back in a box, have made her a reflection of what she is, or less than a whole person, and it's set up the situation so that Sayaka is angry with herself. The directing does a one-to-one job with what Kyubey managed to do in this argument. And throughout the rest of the scene too, we see this thing. We see a visible reduction of Sayaka inside of Kyubey's eye as it describes exactly what that body is. The collection of circulatory systems and nerve endings and meat sac. I think it's pretty clear that's how Kyubey views Sayaka. And the rest of this scene, as Kyubey explains the dangers of combat, it's really hard to misinterpret or, get a different reading here. Kyubey is, whether knowingly or not, torturing Sayaka. If we concede that it doesn't have emotions, then we understand that maybe it doesn't know that this is a bad thing to do, but it understands other social norms, so I don't know. But everything in the directing, Kyubey jumping up, putting the soul gem under its paw, Sayaka crumpling, and then spending the rest of the scene on her knees or writhing in pain beneath Kyubey. Tonally too, with the light and the ominous background music, it's very hard to misinterpret this. You, the viewer, even the first time through, are definitely not supposed to feel good or be okay with what Kyubey's actions are in this scene. And I think it really pulls up the dissonance between the logical part of our brains and the emotional part of our brains that Madoka Magica is playing a ton with already and will continue to. You need to hold on to this feeling here. You need to hold on to your upsettedness with Kyubey's actions here. You need to not surrender to its logic. You need to, like Madoka, stand up in its face and say, that's unacceptable. I cannot live with that type of situation. I'm going to break this system that you are espousing here. Because that's how you do it. That's how you make those inroads into fighting that. And it's going to feel more and more impossible. And I think that those of you who think of this as a hard magic system are going to be more and more willing to acquiesce to Kyubey's structure and system. But Kyubey here is not an all-knowing god come to rain down on the mortals with divine knowledge. It is this hyper-autistic creature that has not and maybe cannot come to understand the value of treating people with respect and compassion, and needs to be shown the error of what it's doing here. Now, that's not the function of this story, nor the function of the series in general, though I do think it would be a really great way of continuing Madoka Magica. Kyubey, for our purposes, only needs to be evil and unable to understand what goes on in the magical girl world. I'm only suggesting that we do not see Kyubey as the most reliable of sources. I mean, aren't we here for the miracles and magic? In that way, the only villain you could possibly write for that would be something hyper-utilitarian, hyper-logical, and it's a great scene to show that. Moving on, this episode, again, heavily edited for the Blu-ray release, and I think this opening shot here of the post-credits scene is one of the better examples of that. The bars here are made to be more dark and more like jail bars. The shots are a bit tighter, and really don't waste any time distracting us before we get the sad cello contrasting with the bright serenity of the classroom, and the absence of Sayaka, of course. Bringing in the sad cello refrain of Serena Ira before the very quick cut to Sayaka under her covers in her bed, and the one very quick establishing shot of Madoka noticing her absence, bring us back tonally into what's going on after the upbeat intro. That quick little snap, the lack of dialogue, makes us think about things more emotionally rather than logically. In Kyubey's scene, it explained what was going on and asked us to think about things using a lot of dialogue. Here we're asked to think about the emotional states of Sayaka, and by extension Madoka thinking about Sayaka, but without a lot of thought. Instead, more feeling. So using music, using no words to do that, helps get us in that mindset. Also really notice the usage of light here. The soul gem emitting light in Sayaka's hands under the covers, divorced from the greater light that Madoka is bathed in of the outside world and relationships and, by extension, everything good about the world. Those room darkening curtains are drawn, the covers of her bed preventing any other light other than the one she's focused on right now, that of her soul gem. Again, the reduction of the girls. The thing that we talked about at the end of the last episode, that your soul being ripped out and your entire existence being made into one wish. It's what Kyubey ends the previous pre-credits scene on, and it's the idea that we come back in on Sayaka focusing on in this scene. Following that, we're once again on the roof. Everything that we've talked about in episode 2 and 3 in regards to the roof still certainly applies. The idea of the cage, the idea of this boundless eternity above them. But there's a bit of an argument, there's a bit of disparity here. But look at the directing, because the directing is going to tell us how we should take each of their sides of this discussion / argument that Madoka and Homura are having. Throughout the entire scene, we continuously look up at Madoka. We are closer to Madoka. We look down upon and are much further from Homura. A simple thing such as tilting the camera up or down to get this perspective tells us the perspectives that we're seeing these characters. Madoka learning of it, trying to rise above it or find some way out of it. Homura aware of it, having accepted the reality of it and drowning in it or falling into it. But the two of them now on the same plane, with realities being revealed to them that they can speak about this issue as equals. Their dialogue doesn't really need further analysis than that. I suppose we could say that Homura identifies Kyubey as antagonistic as the enemy very clearly now. Well, that's what the viewer should believe at this point too, that's fairly obvious. All of her statements are kind of just more in the veins of acknowledging this system that they're in and having to deal with it and how unfair it is and just accepting that it is the way it is. And I think the heavy tone of resignation comes through in both the English and the Japanese. Of course, that extends to her position on Sayaka, and we've seen through multiple timelines that Sayaka always meets this end as Octavia if she doesn't die. Well, always in all the timelines that Homura has seen. We acknowledge that Madoka has not accepted it yet, nor will she ever. And Homura's last line of "I'm not human," again tying back to that wish and that she's reduced herself to someone who only tries to stop Madoka from contracting, or actually more generally protect Madoka. She's abandoned everything, as we said at the end of last episode. You can't be human when you only have one aspect to you. And the shot of her grief seed, as she says it, falls right in line with what we just saw of Sayaka dealing with the same issue. As a general kind of pacing thing, I think this scene needs to be here, right? It needs to have Madoka espouse our feelings as viewers and give us this emotional response that we're saying, that we need to hear somebody be upset with this situation. And it needs to normalize that emotional response to this. Before we accept this as normal, we need to have Madoka stand up and say, no, this isn't normal. We shouldn't be okay with this. In that way, she's very much maintaining that central aspect that she has been over the course of those last couple episodes as the emotional resonant touchstone of this show. That's really what a main character does at the end of the day. So I think I kind of had this galaxy brain take here of, the small brain is Madoka's main character because her name's on the title card. Then the big brain play is Homura is main character because, she drives the plot. And then you come back around, galaxy brain, Madoka is actually main character because she informs us on how we need to look at the world and guides us emotionally through the events of the plot. I like that reading a lot. Anyway, the last thing I'll mention in this scene is the two shots of these kind of, female figures here on the pillars that we haven't seen before as far as I can remember. I don't really have a reading for these. Maybe we could connect them to the figures that we see of Madokami in Rebellion, or I don't know, there's not really this type of art anywhere or made into a symbol anywhere along the lines of the rest of the show. Perhaps let's just consider the fact that there's two female figures kind of looking away from each other in the shot itself, and then we also have two females conflicting ideologically within the scene. If you have a better take for this or if I missed something, let me know. Anyway, moving on to a beautiful little scene here. Love this. First, the shot of Sayaka in the mirror in the bed, being reduced, being put into this little tiny thing in the center, bordered on all sides, and trapped. This also calls back to what we talked about in the pre-credits scene with Sayaka controlling or attempting to control Kyubey, but then Kyubey flipping the reasoning on its head and then putting Sayaka in the box in the mirror. But this symbol doesn't stop there. First, let's acknowledge that Sayaka's line is, how can I ever face Kyosuke now that I've been turned into this thing? And perhaps it's kind of like twofold here. And it doesn't really matter whether Kyosuke would think if your soul has been parted from your body. I don't know, maybe that Japanese thing with the cultural differences on this comes into it. But the idea is that Sayaka is considering what Kyosuke thinks. She's stuck there looking at her soul gem. We've established that the soul gem is linked entirely to her wish, or reducing her to the elements of her wish. Now, in this, she's kind of doing this self-fulfilling prophecy thing. She can't escape the realm of dwelling on this wish and reducing herself to only the fact that she helped heal one boy and based her entire existence around that small and trivial of a wish. But then she's working backwards to justify her pain and her sadness and, oh, pity me, in her head. She's giving the reduction of self legitimacy by dwelling on it and by accepting it. That is why it's so beautiful when all of Sayaka's, wanting to reduce herself and marginalize herself and wallow in that pity, and all the symbols associated with that are broken by Kyoko here. Immediately she rips off the covers, and there's a lot of animation and a good amount of time devoted to her ripping open these curtains. All she needed to stop going down that path was someone to call her on her bullshit, to recontextualize her pain and her sorrow, and expose her back to the outside world very literally, like Kyoko's simple act of reaching out does here. So, the next third of this episode is dedicated to Kyoko's backstory. There's absolutely a lot to be said here, and I want to do it justice, so I'll lay down some superlatives first here. I think this scene in particular is one of the ones that hit me the hardest, or makes me think of my favorite scenes of all time, or that I very cleanly remember coming out of this show. Generally, I think it is a perfect encapsulation of the character dynamics of the story, the art of inukuri being used in a creative and beautiful way, and of the themes, references, and symbols being intertwined to make something really heady and powerful while still adhering to the characters' emotions. Honestly, most of episode 8 and 9 and the impact that those stories have rely on this scene right here. More broadly, it is a contextual way of getting into the mindset that we need to be in for this seeming inescapable. That we were with Sayaka throughout her trials and tribulations, but now we're granted access to Kyoko's as well, something that have been very well hidden up until now, and upon reflection would color everything that we know about Kyoko in a completely different light. Of course, this is entirely similar to episode 10 with Homura, and largely all of that Gen Urobuchi not telling you everything up front style. Let's first acknowledge, though, that this is an olive branch. This is Kyoko reaching out her hand and trying earnestly to help Sayaka, and not in the way that she was trying, scare quotes, trying to help her in episode 5. Now, obviously, this comes from a sense of solidarity from being exposed to the fact that their souls have been ripped from their body. Kyoko isn't inhuman. She's not devoid of any amount of empathy. In fact, she's one of the most empathetic characters in the show. So seeing what Sayaka went through is going to affect her in some way. However, couldn't this also be in response to the previous scene with Homura? Homura not only attempted to establish this element of teamwork, but also earnestly cared for or made an attempt to care for Sayaka Miki's probably inevitable fate. I'm not so much sold on a direct connection there as one that is preeminent and undeniable. I talked a little bit last episode about how you can't put this in a box, how this compassion, this teamwork that has been forcibly removed from this series will reestablish itself necessarily. That it's so intrinsic to the human experience that you can't write a show without it, much less a magical girl show of all things. That is to say, perhaps this is what is keeping the show grounded right now. This is the element that prevents it from becoming something like Magical Girl Raising Sight or something. So then I suppose the question is, as we go into this scene, what stops it from working? I think we find out pretty early, but let's go through some other aspects first. Obviously, the directionality, the tone, the color palette takes a hard shift here. Even before the Blu-ray made it a bit starker, the scene is very harsh, with the yellows and the oranges being the prevailing color theme, and a lot of darkness all around the girls as they walk down the path. I think this does actually mirror the Sayaka vignettes that we saw earlier in the series, at least mood-wise. This is inherently reflecting back onto those Sayaka moments and saying this is similar in that way, just for Kyoko. I mean, very explicitly, this is Kyoko reflecting on how they're similar, right? So I think the color palette doing that is very good of setting that up for our expectations. And directionally, we see Kyoko occupying the left side of the screen throughout this whole scene, going up, Sayaka retreating to the back and the right, matching everything we've always said about directionality and who's making progress where. This is very much Kyoko showing Sayaka a way forward or a path to walk down, and then Sayaka rejecting that. And coming off that static nature in the last scene, this slow pacing of the walking kind of gives it this feel of this is how I managed to move forward, much in the same way that Mommy at the start of episode 3 was doing. It shouldn't be a surprise that the shots are similar in that way. What's more, they're walking by the same stream that Sayaka will later walk down in the following scene, but also that scene that we saw in the opening scenes when they were going to school. Perhaps that mirrors and shows a sort of corruption on that idyllic, innocent school life that they had in episode 1. And that Kyoko was never a part of, at least until Rebellion's opening scene. Anyway, just with the shot composition, the color palette, and the tone, that's 3 separate scenes that this scene is inherently referencing back to. Pretty powerful already. But let's take a look at the directing here on this scene when they're walking to the church. Though Kyoko monologues the entire time, Sayaka says nothing, there is no shot of Kyoko talking. This is kind of putting us in Sayaka's mindset that she's refusing to look directly at what Kyoko is saying. And it's very much relevant that the ideas that Kyoko presents at the beginning of this scene are the same ones that Sayaka is going to reject later on. But she's not fully taking them in here because she hasn't had to, or she's kind of like looking around, avoiding it, and not directly thinking about what Kyoko is presenting as a way to live. They say that when you're trying to convince somebody of something, the best way to do it is to share a story, something personal to you, and rely on that empathy to change their mind. So just by sitting here and telling you logically the arguments here, that Kyoko has found this way that allows her to live, and this is her ideology up on her soapbox, that isn't going to affect Sayaka, and that's why Kyoko needs to provide this backstory. Furthermore, one of the enduring symbols from this scene is going to be the apple. The apple can be used a number of different ways and has been. I'm thinking of something like penguin drum, and it may have some different connotations. One of my favorite things about Japanese is that the kanji associated with fruit is literally the kanji for reward, which I've heard echoes back to a different time. So it can really be seen as this reward for accepting Kyoko's ideology, and that's how it's used later in the scene. However, I think the very much implied and very much easier to understand from a Western mindset reading is the Christian one as we enter a Christian church, that we've come to think of an apple as the fruit that Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor here in this scene after they've gained this knowledge from the end of last episode. Of course, there's some element too of being tempted, right? As the devil tempted Eve with the knowledge to be gained from the fruit of good and evil. And I think that's particularly important for the scene where Sayaka rejects the fruit. However, that interpretation is not what Kyoko recognizes the apple as. As we see it used in her backstory, she acknowledges it as wealth, as being able to flourish, as not falling victim to the harsh realities of the world, a way to rise above, and proof that she has risen above with her ideology. She has apples now in a way that she did not in her past. So I think the directing flaunting that here is really good for showing both these interpretations of it. And I think this visual symbol of the apple, it perfectly encapsulates what's going on that causes these two characters to kind of see past each other or are unable to reconcile in this scene. That's an idea we got to come back to, so hold that one on as we continue chronologically through this scene. I'm going to make a call here and say the best way of considering Kyoko's ideology is to save it for after we've heard her story. Because she repeats it at the end, she offers it to Sayaka here, tells her backstory, and then they fall back on the ideology again. It's the same, it uses kind of the same words and the same symbols, but then Sayaka gives a response to it. So let's hold off on analyzing what she's saying and instead go forward to the church. There is an absolutely beautiful bit of directing with a scene of a nice tree of the girls not walking, standing in front of the church drawn as a Inukuri type witch labyrinth thing, and then an immediate and very hard slam cut to Kyoko's boot kicking down the door, and then a second shot of the door falling over very loudly. It really very much gives the impression that they're attacking something or dredging up something that is peaceful and at rest. With this violence, it also shows the disregard that Kyoko has for the integrity of this past. How little she reveres this place. There's even a third shot of her breaking a board by stepping on it, and the accompanying sound effects are very loud. Other than that, we have the absolute dereliction of the church, all the stained glass that is now broken, shattered, and unappealing, all the shots of saints now scattered on the ground. This too is beautiful for Sayaka because of her morality, that there is something inherent and good and worth fighting for in the Christian ideology and Jesus' words, in the efforts and lives of the saints depicted on these broken walls. And Sayaka needs that to exist. She needs justice to be shown and be prevalent and be flourishing. Kyoko, of course, is at the state where she's rejected that or seen it all come tumbling down and found a different way of moving forward. So this is a very hard place for Sayaka to be in, clinging on to a morality which she is being shown to be frail and ruined. So the rejection of the apple happens next, again with a lot of impact towards the directing of throwing it away, a lot of very large sound effects and violence on Kyoko grabbing Sayaka. Because it's such an extreme reaction, we know that this has a lot of meaning for Kyoko, that this is far more important to her, strikes her on a lower level than any type of social graces, any type of compassion or anything. You do not waste food. This provides an element of mystery. We need to know why Kyoko would react so strongly to that. We've seen her take things that are ostensibly much more severe in a much more laissez-faire type attitude. Why does wasting food trigger her? Also, Sayaka now has personally offended Kyoko with her actions. Unknowingly, of course. Again, she mostly saw that as rejecting Kyoko's ideology or attempts to sway Sayaka to abandon her goodness and righteousness and come over to the dark side. But just on a basic level, Sayaka is now on the back foot, socially. Perhaps that's the reason, or perhaps she just is not caring enough right now, that she lets Kyoko tell her entire backstory. backstory. And the music comes in with a synthesizer little beat as we hear Kyoko's backstory that really gives us a good tonal feel for this. Alright, there's just so much to say for Kyoko's backstory that I think we really have to break it down in pieces here. First, let's talk obviously about the Inukuri animation. It's just so high quality. It's just so perfect for what's going on here. I can't get over it. I still can't get over it. If you've ever read George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, the first book, Game of Thrones, has this scene when Ned is captured called the Tower of Joy. And it's this flashback scene of Ned remembering what went on years in the past. It's him in a borderline unconscious state, and it's told with a very inconclusive, dreamlike quality. So when I heard that Game of Thrones was getting an adaptation for television, the thing that I thought of right away when I thought of them doing all the scenes in the first book was this scene in Madoka Magica for the Tower of Joy scene. Now, they didn't do that, and more's the pity. But just to say that I think conveying this type of flashback scene using different animation and in a fantasy context, in a character recounting what has happened, this is obviously not literally what's going on, even in a show that is very rarely literally what's going on. But these layers of detachment from the events really give it a feel of focusing on what's important or how Kyoko views her history. For example, take the first shot. This is her father looking up at these saints that we've just talked about of, representing these pure Christian ideals of compassion, of understanding, of love. Kyoko says he was a good man. The first parallel we have here is Sayaka to Kyoko's father. Both are inherently good people. Both inherently trust in these good, righteous values. Both have the best of intentions. And we see that by the whiteness in the background of the stained glass. That's further enforced by Kyoko's description of him as someone who would read the papers and start tearing up because he couldn't figure out how to make the world a better place. There's also the symbol of the candle, which is this kind of light on a hill metaphor, this flame of passion, of guidance, of direction, of spreading light out onto the world, and is something that we see again associated with Kyoko at various points, even so far as her witch design, in the extended media franchise, of course. Let's also note here Kyoko's representation of herself and her younger sister, how they have smiles plastered onto their papercraft faces. Let's also acknowledge here the people are represented featureless, all with Kyoko's brooch on their necks. They later become active when Kyoko, uses her wish in the story. So maybe that's a representation of the inevitability or how Kyoko is going to see them as souls that she's going to control and influence. It goes along with how Kyoko is presenting this story visually, that she is holding up the papercraft puppets. Think of something like Yuki Yuna is a Hero, which begins on this type of play. It's something for younger children, right? It's something easy to understand. And Kyoko, as somebody who had no or little formal education, would tell stories in this way. But also consider that later Kyoko says she's always been a fan. It'll be like one of those stories where miracles and magic triumph. So she inherently likes the art of storytelling and relates to things in a narrative medium, or is one of those people who understands the world through stories. So this is a perfect way of describing how this character, based on her backstory, would describe the reasons behind her motivations and her mindset and her worldview through narrative storytelling. On this shot in particular, with Kyoko looking at the papercraft puppet, we have like another layer of breaking intradiegetic distance in Madoka Magica, as if the show wasn't steeped enough in that already. The background is her story world, but she's placed in it. This is her going in there, revisiting it, and, controlling it and telling it like it's a story of her memory, yes, but also embodying it and revisiting that area, that space, that she left behind so long ago. What's real here? What does reality mean in any type of meaningful context? This could all be a fabrication, but if Kyoko believes it as much as she clearly does, it's very real. Another beautiful shot here of the discarded apple cores and her younger sister crying. Now, when she broaches the subject of them being poor, then we get that emotional hit. I don't know if you've ever been as poor as Kyoko is here. I haven't been that poor, but I have been very poor to the point where I've stolen food out of a trash can. I think, though, that is something so universal and something so primal that it's impossible to misunderstand the emotions behind this. Deep in your soul, you understand that no one should have to starve. So the emotional through line is very resonant, especially with the addition of the younger sister there, and then Kyoko guides us from that emotional resonance into a thought process, right? She says, I couldn't understand it. My father wasn't saying or doing anything wrong, yet we are starving. I want to interject here before we go down Kyoko's line of thinking to kind of talk about the allegory here between Sayaka and Kyoko's father. Obviously the good intentions, obviously Kyoko saying he's not wrong, obviously the whole, pride and going forward with that morality in mind, the whole being a hero and helping people, and the steadfast obstinance for these heroic values. And of course, knowing what we know, the untimely end or the unwillingness for the world to support that type of viewpoint in a very literal sense. If you hold on to that too tightly, it will kill you. So it makes sense why Kyoko is comparing the two or sharing this with the one person she sees emulating that fact. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside, and let's head back to thinking about how Kyoko is going to see this, feel it, and then reconcile it to come up with a new outcome. So that creates this dissonance, this problem people have with God. If God exists and he is all-powerful and all-knowing, why is there suffering in the world? A question that people have dealt with throughout human history. That the world is not fair. There is injustice here. How can we live when there is no righteousness or no inherent goodness on which we may be judged? That Terry Pratchett quote that I brought up a couple episodes ago. Kyoko is dealt a bad hand, like so many people, even today, still are. And her effusive pleas to understand her father that he was actually right, that should strike us as something that very easily could happen too. That there's still no justice in the world. And I'm sure all of us could have examples of times when we were in the right, but were discarded out of hand, or not served, or not honored for that. And in the context of modern Christianity, at least in the way that it is seen prominently in America nowadays, that's very reasonable and something that we see very often. A close-mindedness, a refusal to adapt. And it's not surprising then that Kyoko's emotions here turn to anger. It's irreconcilable. You need some way to cope with that. And it should be no surprise as Kyoko kind of flails around looking for a way to justify this to herself, that more and more of the witch labyrinth imagery, the Inukuri backgrounds, come around and surround her. The candles of her witch form burn brightly. This is something that would send someone into despair. And we even see her soul gem featured in this shot, and Sayaka quietly bears witness. When Kyoko talks about her wish and making her wish, her tone changes. It removes from the Inukuri witch labyrinth-esque design, and we see again a repeat of the symbol we saw earlier with Sayaka looking into the glossy apple finish, with Kyoko looking at herself in the glossy apple finish. Again, really with the metaphor of the apple being Kyoko's worldview of don't go hungry, of this is the way I've justified my actions unto myself. That's what the wish was for Kyoko. And we also see here a reprisal of the hairless masses with Kyoko's soul gem emblazoned on them. Of course now with red eyes that absolutely only mean mind control. And then Kyoko's backstory, as we are of course expecting now, breaks bad. The shots of Sayaka and Kyoko both cut out their eyes. eyes, signaling very harsh negative emotions, and downcast looks. The next bit, and probably one of the most poignant bits in the scene, is when Kyoko's father calls her a witch, and Kyoko reacts to that. Yet again, we have the idea that magical girls are already witches, or the witch is no different than the magical girl. Of course, we kind of see this idea too of people not being a family, or a family not being able to accept one another, or Kyoko not being provided the emotional support she would need to flourish here in a traditional magical girl family route, and in fact given the exact opposite. And this is ironic too because of Kyoko's father preaching against the church and then falling back on something so old-timey puritanical as a witch. The show even features Joan of Arc burned alive for being a witch. So the failure of Kyoko's father here provides us that context again for Madoka's relationship with Junko. Junko basically discovers Madoka about as much as she can without knowing the full thing, but she does the exact opposite. She supports her. She lets her go. Would that Kyoko's father have done the same? She wouldn't have ended in this position, and it would be a much worse story. So let's continue. Just again, more very beautiful Inukuri designs here. I like that it also mirrors the headlessness and the firehead of Kyoko's witch form, Ophelia. I think we mentioned it when we first talked about Kyoko, but Ophelia, again from Hamlet, goes crazy after her father dies and drowns herself in a river. But that doesn't happen here. We don't see Ophelia in Madoka Magica. And Kyoko somehow survives this, survives her namesake, and goes on living. And the reason why comes in her resolution, which she states outright. She would never use magic again to help anyone else. But her two lines before that, very important too, that she brought this misfortune on her family. She doesn't find a way to absolve herself of this guilt or rectify what she's done or wash it away in her mind. She bears that weight. Of course, it also brings up the idea of a wish just turning around and destroying everything you loved, which of course we'll see in the following scene with Hitomi and going after Violin Boy. Of course, why Sayaka's knees buckle and why we cut to Sayaka's knees buckling. But the last line here, very, very important. Kyoko says, I made a wish for my dad without knowing what he really wanted. Again, reflective on Sayaka and Kyosuke. But too reflective on everything that's going on in this show. Reflective on everything we've been talking about so far. Who has earnestly tried to understand another person in this show? Who has earnestly opened their heart to someone else? Madoka, right? And who has drawn lines in the sand? Who has rationed away empathy and compassion and making an earnest attempt to understand one another? Everybody else. Perhaps this reason is why Kyoko is at least willing to do what she's doing in this scene. She promised never to use magic for someone else's sake, but she understood that miscommunication or not opening yourself to other people was part, at least, of what caused the downfall of her family. And she's at least willing to change on that mistake. Now, a couple things here. We're back at Kyoko restating her ideology and offering it unto Sayaka as a way of coping and moving forward and embracing the life that she now leads. But then we're also introduced to Kyoko's kind of justification of why bad stuff happens, which is largely a result of that problem she was talking about earlier. She floats this kind of Taoist idea that things must be in equality. It's something that Kyubei also brings up later, that Sayaka and Homura both come to accept as well. But in some way I find this personally the most preposterous and the most unacceptable here. And that's why I am on the side of Madoka. That's why I support this ending of Madoka Magica. Because that's not a fast law, or humans have to behave as if that's not a fast law. That doing good is worth it because it will create more good. Paradoxically, I think perhaps if Kyoko abandons that, if Kyoko has some other reason to fight beyond that idea, that harming others will make her life easier, then perhaps she's able to get there. Perhaps she's able to call Sayaka back from the void. Perhaps she's able to be a Madoka. But there's no reason for her to know that. And her coping mechanism, such as it is, her worldview, built as it is by her history, wouldn't allow for that. She needs to wake up every day and stave off the absurdity of the world. And this quid pro quo, this survival of the fittest, this welcoming of the burden of what she is now bearing, is the way that she can justify existing. It's how she can squash the absurdity of her past and the unfairness of everything into something tangible and understandable. It's how she copes. And we're back again at the same problem we were in episode 5. We're back at that Madoka moment. We can't tell Kyoko that she's wrong because she's not. Her existence, her history, her emotions are real and poignant and justified and meaningful and passionate. And we have to love her for how she understands the world and everything that she's been through. Again, going back to Camus, we must imagine Kyoko happy and love her for finding that. Unfortunately, of course, Sayaka is not ready to do that. She is not abrasive here, confused as she says. And she doesn't tell Kyoko that her methods or her way of thinking is wrong. She even flat out apologizes to Kyoko. She recognizes this is an olive branch. And the directing, very good here, puts them stationary, puts them directly opposed, puts them on the same level. They're quite literally seeing eye to eye. And then we come back to the question that I asked at the beginning of the scene. Why does Sayaka refuse Kyoko's worldview? Why is she unable to accept this kind of Camus-esque live for yourself, live for the moment philosophy? Well, the writing surrounding it is sublime. Sublime, I tell you. She has a couple lines, leading up to it, but I think the one I really want to jump to right quick is the "where did you get those apples?" accusing Kyoko of stealing them. We have here two characters that represent the extremes. Kyoko has her completely live for herself ideology. Sayaka has completely the self-sacrificial gallant hero philosophy of always stick to the high-minded ideals of right and wrong. Sayaka, of course, believes in miracles and magic. Sayaka believes in acting justly even when no one is around to witness it. Perhaps there is some sunk cost fallacy already for Sayaka. I mean, Kyoko did have a hard turn on her worldview after her father's murder-suicide. That shows a lot of strength on Kyoko's part. But Sayaka sticking to her ideals here and not surrendering the values that she based her wish upon, in continuing down that path of being what she believes to be a paragon of righteousness, an ally of justice, Sayaka has demonstrated much the same strength. It's a conscious decision, and that's why I love this scene. It shows Kyoko's conscious decision to shape her own worldview, to find out who she is, to make her wish her own. And it shows Sayaka seeing that, recognizing that, respecting Kyoko's decision and saying that will not work for me. Because of who I am, because of what I value, because of the person I want to become, she cannot be Kyoko. And no one is wrong here. No one can be criticized. When Sayaka walks out of this church, Kyoko knows that the path she's on will lead eventually, to her demise. That's why she's so angry, because she can't criticize Sayaka, and yet she knows that her own actions are going to hurt her. This is an intervention. This is trying to save someone from themselves in a way that magical girls often do. But one character doesn't repent and change their ways because neither of them is inherently wrong. Neither of them is out there as a cackling villain. Neither of them falters in their resolve for what their positions are. Because, and, justifiably, both of their positions are fully grounded, are fully realized, and are functional ways of justifying their existence, of staving off the absurdity of the situation they're in. However, I think the mixing of the two ideologies, the exposure of them to each other, that's so beautiful. And what's even more beautiful is how they end up affecting one another. But that's something for later. So as Sayaka turns and walks out of the church, I think there's perhaps the best single directing shot. And no, that's not the stained glass angel stabbing Kyoko. That is good. Yes, that's a nice way of showing Sayaka countering Kyoko's ideology. And yes, a nice foreshadowing to Octavia. No, the best shot, I think, in a scene that is so full of best shots is the music here of the nylon stringed guitar, the beats of the song Sis Puella Magica. As they hit, Kyoko chomps into the apple, the symbol of her ideology, frustrated now with each bite that her words were unable to reach Sayaka. Oh, so powerful. This seems as good a time as any to mention that the Kyoko and Sayaka relationship is one that fans have immediately attached to, and probably has a little more prominence in the fandom than even Madoka and Homura. It's really interesting that even despite Madoka and Homura's more central importance to the plot, the screen time given to each Puella Magi is about equal, or that we stay with each character for about the same amount of time. Maybe Sayaka a bit more in that we're seeing the experience of the magical girl through her. So why then is this relationship made out to be one that fans feel heavily about, and that would come back in Rebellion again to be tied up with that hand-holding scene during the fight? Why are there so many pairings, so many ships of Sayaka and Kyoko? Well, I think it's really because of exactly what we said here. Each character is not only fleshed out in their own right as a fully functionable person, but they have this dichotomy, this duality of looking at the world, that they sit on two ends of the spectrum, and they have this whole scene right here of trying to work that out. Of course, reconciliation isn't a thing that's going to happen here, and Madoka in her wish is kind of on a different end of the spectrum, or perhaps we consider the values that Madoka holds in her worldview on somewhere else and not on this 1D line that we would judge Kyoko and Sayaka on. So these rams butting heads, but ideologically, and that there is an undercurrent of compassion and of meaningful understanding gained here, but it's not enough, or it doesn't provide an outcome that is a solution to the problem, and that kind of tragedy to both their stories, that feels really, or that it comes across really as impactful, meaningful, and realistic because it's so grounded. We believe that Kyoko Sakura, out of her own volition, as who she is as a character, would want to help Sayaka Miki. And we believe that out of her own established characterization over the series, that Sayaka Miki would decline Kyoko Sakura's help. And that's beautiful and tragic. And doesn't that always make for the best romance? We have, again, the same transition sequence back to Sayaka walking alone on that same cobblestone sidewalk by the stream that we've seen since episode 1. And this time, of course, the colors give us the intuition that she's back in this normal world, back in episode 1's world. Of course, her head down and her eyes cold out makes that not seem the same tonally, but then Madoka and and Hitomi come running into the scene. This shot with putting us in Sayaka's point of view and then seeing Madoka and Hitomi appear before her mimics Madoka in episode 1, and it is in fact called back to in Rebellion. So it's really easy to understand Sayaka as being stuck in this thinking about what happened and then Madoka and Hitomi pulling her out of it. But before that's able to happen, before Sayaka's able to think about things in depth or readjust or have any time to herself, the ramifications of her wish come to bear, and they see Kyosuke limping along. Now here, look at the directing here. Look at the little exchanges between Madoka and Sayaka. Look at them in the classroom when she suggests to go say something to Kyosuke and Sayaka declines. Look how there is a cut to Hitomi looking intently at Sayaka's answer. And now we're back at episode 2, Girls Can't Love Girls. Is Hitomi mistaken for interpreting what's going on in her way that she does? No. Is she mistaken for doing what she's about to do and thirsting after Kyosuke? No. Hold on though, let's look at the directing first. Sayaka is put alone here in the cafeteria. And yeah, face to face. Again, shots of their faces very intimately, making sense for something so intimate as this. And the weird timbre of the music comes in when Hitomi confesses her love of Kyosuke to Sayaka. The birds chirping and the flute that we heard as Madoka ran out of her house in episode 1 aren't here, because this, of course, is something to cause Sayaka to spiral into despair. And on that we have a disconcerting shot of above. I think this is kind of one of the ones I like to call a monogatari shot. I don't know if I love it, but I think it does a lot to kind of throw us off in the same way that Sayaka is. She also moves, she covers her chest like she's been punched. She reels and she kind of falls back on these social graces of, oh, I hope he knows how lucky he is. And if Sayaka again was allowed to deflect like she tries to in a couple different places throughout the series, then maybe it would be a much more boring or a much more slow-paced burn. But again, Hitomi does not allow that. She, still frowning, still with her serious eyes on, presses Sayaka further. She's not going to allow her not to face this. Is Hitomi's offered ultimatum too strong of a thing, too forceful of an action? Surely we can't judge her as wrong or mean for doing so. And of course, from a storytelling perspective, it's perfect to press Sayaka's buttons or force her to take some action and still be reeling. Let's of course allow that it is believable, even if it's unforeseen to us, the viewer, right? It very much puts us in Sayaka's shoes of being blindsided, that she was too concerned with all this, magic soul gem bullshit that she didn't even think about stuff like this, or didn't even try to connect to other people to understand how they're feeling. So in that way, maybe what we could dock Hitomi points for is not really giving a good heart-to-heart with Sayaka that would really allow her an outlet to talk about her feelings with Hitomi and really open up and work through them together, which I think would be the traditional magical girl solution to this issue. See Sailor Moon and Princess Tutu, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, I throughout these videos, I like to point out these points where the things could be adverted, but they aren't, to tell the story that Urobuchi wants to tell. And of course, it's not unrealistic that things don't fall in those lines, or that they take a turn for the sadder. Let's move on to talking about it as a motivation here, that Hitomi very specifically uses the words, "I don't want you to have any regrets," which of course Sayaka just got done telling Kyoko that she would not live with any regrets from now on. How many shows will you have a character, state their philosophy and then be called out in their hypocrisy in the very next scene? Well, let's look at how Sayaka takes it. And if it's emotional compassion that Hitomi was lacking in the previous scene, cutting right to Madoka is a beautiful way of doing it. And I think that Madoka's voice actors in both English and Japanese are really great in this scene. Of course, Aoi Yuki is one of the strongest and best voice actors of the modern era, but I think Cabanos was really sketchy throughout a lot of Madoka Magica, or didn't fit entirely into the role of Madoka, or missed a couple line reads throughout the English dub. However, here, as demure, as compassionate, as a friend to stand beside you as you walk through your trial, she nails it. Also, shoutouts to her as Mako in Kill la Kill. That's another role where she completely perfectly embodies the character. Anyway, more than anything else, this is an example of what a magical girl is, or what a friend in compassion is to a magical girl. I'm reminded myself of one of my favorite Sailor Moon episodes when Mako is dancing with Tiger's Eye at the dance, and you've seen her in the dress, you've seen her dance with Ami, but do you remember that part of the episode where she waits for Tiger's Eye in the rain, and instead of criticizing her, instead of, telling her that what she's doing is wrong and she needs to have a better worldview, what do the other sailor soldiers do? They wait beside her in the rain all night. It's yet another one of those examples where I would say it's very, very hard to create or consume Madoka Magica without first understanding where it's coming from, emotionally and thematically. Anyway, Sayaka's grappling with the fact that who she is not a perfect embodiment of the hero or the ally of justice that she believed Mami to be. Of course she's not. Of course, you're a human. Again, you can't reduce yourself to this ideal of a superhero. You feel and you want and you cry, and you'll never be perfect. You'll never be so far on the spectrum as to embody one entire thing. Just as Kyoko is never able to live entirely for herself, so too is Sayaka never able to reach the lofty ideals she set for herself. And now we come to kind of the contradiction here, that Sayaka believes that because of her status as a magical girl, she can never have a normal life with Kyosuke. Now, I initially, on the surface, recoil at this. I've seen plenty of magical girls, maintain a romantic relationship. However, it's never quite the same as it would be without it. Again, to reference another Sailor Moon episode, do you remember the time Minako asks Haruka how she feels about being a sailor soldier and doesn't she wish for a normal life? And Haruka answers that she has something better than an ordinary life, or that she'll never have that ordinary life, and she understands that, but the life she leads now is not something she sees as inferior. Again, there are many, many more Sailor Moon and other Magical Girl show episodes. Honestly, I could probably give you one from every Magical Girl show that I've seen myself, where the characters deal with the same issue. But that awareness to get on that level of Haruka of, I will never have that normalcy. I'm something different now because of this calling, and it's going to keep me from being in that normal everyday life, but I'm going to accept that. I'm going to embrace that, and I'm going to, transform that into something that I can enjoy, that will satisfy me, and that will have its own unique brand of happiness. That's the answer to the problem that Sayaka is dealing with right now. However, that's a hard thing to find. And, if we want to be very kind to the end of Rebellion, that's something that is still being searched for even within this series, right? But to come back to what we were speaking about as we first got into this, it's understandable then that Sayaka sees this as impossible. Because it is, way has led on to way, it has transformed, and what she had in her mind as a potential outcome that she was going to work towards when she first made this wish is now not a possibility that exists. And yes, given support and time and a lot of compassion and people around her to lift her up, she would probably be able to work her way to some type of realization about that. But that's not what Kyoko offered here, and the scene ends before Madoka can give anything like that. Not that Madoka would even be aware enough to know anything like that, but yeah, if we plop Sayaka down in the end of Princess Tutu or, Symphogear or something like that, she'd figure it out. But instead, we get the ending of episode episode 7 of Madoka Magica. So now I think for the first time we get the scenery that we saw in the background of Sayaka's riverbed scene with the oil refinery, or whatever this is, I don't know. It's obviously dark, it's obviously industrial, and it's obviously not a place with a lot of warmth to it. And the winds, once again, of change, of decision making are blowing through. And credit to, the preparation on the team, or the planning for this, to have this scene with Homura and Kyoko sitting back and watching. It again plays with this diegetic distance that we're watching Sayaka fall into despair just as these two other characters are, and both of them already have tried to kind of save her from her ultimate fate, albeit not very successfully because they don't really know how to do that. But the voyeurist angle of this scene is very powerful. It also, of course, shows that Kyoko has kind of come around on Sayaka, is going to let Sayaka go through her motions, or, respect her more as a person. But yeah, isn't it offensive? Isn't it bad for us too? Especially when Homura calls it out, saying, why aren't we doing something here? And Homura is at least transformed and ready to go. Kyoko is not even ready to lend a hand, though she does. So aren't we, the viewers, too, kind of this passive participant in Sayaka's downfall? Aren't we just as guilty? And maybe in some way, aren't we just as responsible for her redemption that comes in rebellion? That's an interesting idea. We should hold on to that one. Anyway, let's talk about Elsa Maria, because this is a fight so filled, and a witch so filled with meaning, that it's really impossible to overstate how awesome it is. Obviously, we have the innate Christian reference here, that it takes place in a church. There's all this cross symbology, that she's sitting there praying. Again, we just got done this scene in the raised church. We've already been thinking in this kind of Christian motif about Sayaka's quest for eternal rightness and justness. Indeed, more information on the witch in the extended franchise. She is the witch of self-righteousness, which is the poison taking Sayaka's soul right now. She's named after Elsa Maria Pacini, who, after being forced into an arranged marriage, had her second husband stolen from her, and wrote a lot of very upsetting poetry about it. She even descended into madness, poor and forgotten by everyone, by the end of her life. So too is it associated with Ave Maria, which Kyosuke, we pointed out, was playing earlier, further establishing the Christian symbology, praying to the Virgin Mary, now slashing at the Virgin Mary, or some representation or extension thereof, and fighting again those ideals that she promised herself, the idea of an ally of justice, the purity of the soul that she can no longer manage, that has come to drag her down. There's also a tree symbology in here, further tying into the apple that we saw Kyoko offer to Sayaka earlier. Furthermore, some extended universe deep lore shit, and yes, I'm reading you the wiki right now. The lines on her labyrinth are, I wish you, although not seen from me, to be happy. Of course, exactly the same as Sayaka's troubles right now. The idea now that witches are a state of the magical girl, or the idea now that this is so inevitable, or that so many magical girls have been where Sayaka is right now, have been unable to reconcile these situations as Sayaka is now, seems blatantly obvious, seems eternally apparent. And everything's in black and white. Everything's lost all of its color, as Sayaka desperately tries to maintain this idea of good and evil, of purpose, of meaning, of following that path that begins to crumble around her. The silhouette animation is so beautiful. And now what I believe is the first time we hear Sayaka's theme, Decretum. It means very literally something decreed, a collection of decisions and judgments in canon law. The specific one that is generally known as decretum is something from the Catholic Church's history in the 13th century. So even by the name of the song that's playing in the background of this scene, we have a direct allusion to somebody establishing right and wrong, to somebody saying what is morally just and what isn't. Furthermore, I think the highs and the lows of decretum, the up and down rhythm, gives it a spiral effect that is mirrored very closely in Octavia's theme. And it has this element of sorrow to it, of sad hopelessness, of winding down. Aesthetically, the last minute of episode 7 of Madoka Magica is very hard to watch. Over that music, there is just shot after shot of Sayaka taking another hit after another hit, painfully bleeding. I think many fan arts and many people remember the stark aesthetic of this silhouette theme, but also the bloody smile of Sayaka as she overkills Elsa Maria. And that, of course, is because it's such a powerful and such a moving, emotional moment. What is something that should be just, or should be good, or should be a positive thing, killing this witch, has instead become a very terrible thing. It's only in the context of a whole episode and a whole character arc where someone refuses to acknowledge the grays and the subtleties of the situation that a victory can be so pyrrhic. Again, I'll emphasize, because I don't really have the words to describe Sakuga, just how beautiful this all is. Aesthetically, I mean, visually. Do you also remember in Rebellion, in Sayaka's transformation scene, where she goes into the sprinter's pose? Do you remember that that's a direct callback to this episode? But I'll not let you forget directionality, because it's incredibly important here. What does Sayaka do? She runs back to the right, where she came from. That ideals that she started out with and has to fight. She's not going forward, she's not making progress. In her Rebellion transformation, which way does she go? She heads to the left, because she's a different person, a different character, and somebody who's rushing towards a better future for herself, and for others and those she loves. Here though, here and now, her only solution, her only way to deal with what she's been shown and what she's been forced to deal with, is to shut it all out, is to not acknowledge it, just attack what's in front of her. It's at this point we know what she said at the start of episode 4 is going to come true. She's not going to have a happy end, because she can't find an ideology to go on living. And finally, what's more on top of that, she says, "I'll do it myself." Partly out of her respect for Madoka and Kyoko, she doesn't want them to get drugged down in the same way that she is being. And this, the solitary mindset, the rejection of the teamwork and the bearing your burdens together, that's the most damning thing in this scene. And you find this in a lot of, media that attacks that type of purpose or why go on living. Everything from Nier Automata to Evangelion to many magical girl shows. That the weight of the world is easier to bear together. And Sayaka could go on living, if not for Kyosuke, then for someone else. If she learned that and took that and made that into her worldview. But she's not. And she's going to suffer for it. Next episode, of course, provided this YouTube channel still stands as viewable, we will talk about Sayaka's ultimate fate, though perhaps maybe not as ultimate as we think. But I think for a large part, it's already sealed here at the end of episode 7. All in all, I do think that Madoka Magica really has its payoffs now in episodes 6 through 9, and I'm always astounded on revisiting it at just the efficacy by which the show pursues its desired outcomes. It's magical, really. It really is a beautiful, beautiful work. And once again, thank you all for sticking with me through it. Oh, and hey, big shoutouts to the person with the acrylic characters in the name who sent me some amount of rubles or something amounting to like $6. That is actually the first actual money I have ever made off any of my ideas or content. It means a lot to me, and you will always have the honor and special place in my heart for being my first.